Thank you. So I'm going to come at this from the perspective of a former regulator. I think as Fabio said before, Cisco was at the FCC for many years. And I'm thinking about it in terms of the regulators in this room and the conversation we've been having over the last several days. And I remember when existing players, when we were opening up the telecom market. And by the way, Paul, actually, I led the team that designed the first spectrum auctions, right? And Paul, you know, we had this really, really hard problem of how to stop an auction, if you recall, right? And you did the breakthrough. I mean, it was Paul's genius that actually led to the successful spectrum auctions in the United States in the 90s. And that was one of the most intellectually difficult and satisfying things that I ever did. And then the last session here, obviously, was continued with the incentive auction. So that's really great. But in those days, when we were opening up the market and having new entrants come in then cellular mobile, what was really interesting was that the existing player, I hate the word incumbent, right? Because it's not about incumbents. It's about existing players. The existing players came in and said, well, if you're going to open up this market, if you're going to allow competition coming in, that's not fair. We have to have all kinds of constraints on the new entrants, right? And of course, the new entrants would come to us and say, well, if you don't open up the market, we're dead, right? We're not going to have a chance, right? And you have to let us into the market. And so as a regulator, you have to weigh the arguments on both sides with a great deal of cynicism on all of those arguments and actually ask for evidence. And the reason I say that is because we know that empirically competition works and it brings huge benefits. We just know that. And previous IICs with Chris, some of the work that he did when he was the regulator in Australia, providing flexibility for mobile operators in Australia to refarm their spectrum without having to get additional permission, allowed Telstra to bet the company on LTE, pre-standard, and it was able to do that without having to pay any additional fees. Didn't have to get permission from the regulator. It bet the company, and it won, and it led the market, and as a result, it forced all of the other operators in Australia to invest in LTE before they wanted to. And as a result, Australia was one of the 2 or 3 countries leading the world in LTE deployment. We're seeing the same story today, actually over the last 12 months in India with Jio. None of the operators in India wanted to deploy LTE. They were not ready. They were still just deploying 3G and wanted to harvest that investment. Reliance Jio comes in, deploys LTE everywhere, forced the other operators to deploy. As a result, it has totally transformed the mobile market, the broadband market, the startup market, the digital market in India. Totally changed it. The competition drives innovation, and competition drives investment, notwithstanding the fact that many of the existing operators say, oh, too much competition destroys investment. Nonsense. We've seen it time and again where competition forces and drives investment. But then you end up with the regulatory question. And you always have the argument about asymmetric regulation, regulation that's not fair. And you have 2 players, and when we had this at the FCC, where you had a new entrant coming in, we call them competitive local exchange carriers, small carriers, local exchange competitors to the incumbent operators. This is sort of the old AT&T days. Sorry, Kareem.
2 generations ago.
Yeah, it's before you were born. But the argument right, by AT&T was, oh, you're letting these people in, but they don't have the same regulation obligations that we do. That's asymmetric regulation. And the argument is you have two players, they're similarly situated, but you have a different regulatory regime. Well, actually, the incumbent operators, the existing operators, who were the monopolies, and we were opening up the market, right? And you can think about this here in Europe with the interconnection rules, the unbundling rules, and so on. But the reality was that the dominant player was not similarly situated to what we in the US call the non-dominant player. And in fact, we had different rules for dominant and non-dominant, because you can have two types of asymmetry. If you have two firms that are the same and they're similarly situated, but the regulation is different, you'll have regulatory arbitrage. That doesn't work for the market, for consumers, for investment, for innovation. But the other type of asymmetric regulation, if you will, is if you have firms that are not the same, not similarly situated, but they are regulated the same. And that would have killed innovation. It would have killed the new entrants, the non-dominant players in the telephone market in the US. Why am I talking about that, and how is that relevant? We see that playing out here. We see that playing out actually in some of the debate about the code, because we see that dressed up as a phrase called same service, same rules, which sounds great. It sounds terrific. The problem is that, and I'll get really concrete, we're not talking about the same service. My friend Kareem talked about all the different messaging that you use. One of the issues that some, not all, of the existing operators say is, we had something called SMS. We made a lot of money from SMS. And now there are all of these other services that are taking money away from SMS because we no longer can charge as much as we did. And so therefore we have to impose regulation on all of those new applications. Well, actually, in the name of a level playing field, in the name of the same service, same rules. It's really interesting. I don't know how many of you have seen a study by WIC, the German consultancy, but they looked at what they ended up calling rich interaction applications. It's kind of a difficult phrase. It's not messaging, and it's not the full internet. It's someplace in between, but it's always about interaction. It's about two parties or more interacting. So it's not internet browsing, but it's not just SMS. And in fact, what they did was they looked at 139 rich interaction applications globally, including everything from WeChat in China to WhatsApp, Messenger, iMessage, Viber, Line, all of the above. And they found that the average RIA is what they call them, has 8 or 9 functions. WeChat has 60 different functions, adding new functions every other week. I know that at WhatsApp we're adding functions all the time. Things that, by the way, SMS never did. But in fact, people are using it, and they're using it in addition to SMS, but because of all of these other functions, the traditional operators can no longer charge 10 cents euro for an SMS. The marginal cost of an SMS is 0. So what we're seeing is, in a competitive market, a contestable market, prices being driven to marginal cost. That's a good thing for consumers. But when I go back to my days as a regulator, existing players are saying, oh, this is really hard. And it is. But it doesn't mean that you want to impose the legacy regulation on these new types of applications that actually are very different from the legacy application or service called SMS. So one of the questions, Fabio, that really is top of mind is, as the market is becoming more competitive, and we also have to have, as Karim said, we need to think about the market definition, Augustine as well. We need to also think about regulatory implications. And when markets become more competitive, more contestable, I always thought the answer was to actually have less regulation, regulate down, not regulate up. And as a result of some of the existing regulation, what you saw yesterday from both Rebecca Arbogast as well as from Wolfgang Kopp from Deutsche Telekom, is that, frankly, I believe that we've kept the regulation to open the market for the network operators in Europe in place long after it was still justified, and as a result, we're killing investment in networks in Europe. And so, again, this is something I think we really need to look at very seriously, because it's about incentives for investment and innovation, and not misusing notions of competition to increase regulation. Thank you.